Idleman Unplugged is part of the Edify podcast network.
I want to see your face, pass me by the crowds of people, the priests who sing your praise.
Hello, my name is Shane Idleman, and I'm the pastor of Westside Christian Fellowship in Leona Valley, California. It is my personal heart and goal for you to see truth through a biblical perspective. I hope that you enjoy this segment of Idleman Unplugged.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Idleman Unplugged. My name is Luke Duncan, and I'm your host here with Pastor Shane Idleman. Pastor, welcome.
Welcome. Good to be here.
Something that's kind of, well, it's always been in the conscience of the church, but, you know, with the times that we're going through right now, it kind of has bubbled back up within the conscience of more of the church than it normally does. And that's the topic of the end times. And specifically, the Great Tribulation and the Rapture are two topics that come up. You can't really talk about one without talking about the other. So we're going to do our best to kind of delve into both of those in this
briefly
segment. Yeah, it's brief as you can be with those topics. But there's a lot of different opinions out in the church with respect to what both of those things are and what both of them will look like and when they're going to happen and all of that sort of stuff. So, Shane, is the church in the 21st century, from your perspective, what can we expect with the tribulation and with the rapture?
Well, I think it's important to clarify both of those. The early church fathers believed a certain way, and then later on, Martin Luther, John Calvin believed a different way. A lot of what you believe has to do with what you're seeing in the world. And that's why we have a different view even. And I do believe you do get further, not revelation as far as truth, but you can kind of better understand where things are going the more, you know.
You've dug a little deeper.
Yeah. And we've lived 1,000 more years or 500 more years than Luther and Calvin. But the rapture is, and I would just encourage you, if you're listening, just Google verses for the rapture. And Paul talks about there will be, like in a twinkling of an eye, there will be a catching up. It actually comes from the word rapture is in the Bible. It's a catching away. It's meeting Jesus in the sky. It's where this image where you will be caught up. You can be working out in the field or getting married or whatever, and every believers are caught up to Christ. Now, that gets interesting. We'd have to spend probably another half hour on, many believe, and I'm kind of, I kind of straddle the fence here a little bit because, the rapture, that's different than his second coming, or some people see it as one event, because when he comes again, saints come up, that's his second coming, that's boom, that's done. But we have to see it, or some see it as two events, because there's a rapture of a church, and then there's a period of time for a while, the tribulation and Great Tribulation, and then the Christ comes again, a second coming. So I'm kind of having, just where I'm at personally, having a hard time seeing two different events. I know, like Michael Brown will teach that we go through the tribulation. Others say we're out of here before the tribulation. Others say there's no tribulation, that Revelation was fulfilled, or it's allegory, the reason is this, and I'll just shoot our listeners straight. I've listened to Dr. David Jeremiah for many years, Chuck Smith, Jack Hibbs, and so many great Bible teachers, John MacArthur. And, there are different views because the Bible is not crystal clear. For me, and I've read it dozens of times, the 7 weeks in Daniel, and how they say, 1 week is still to come, and this means this, and this means this. There's a lot of, guessing's not the right word. Assumptions, filling in the blanks, like, well, this could happen, and so it's not like boom, 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 here's what's going to happen. You have to take this, and it was Daniel, when he talked about, the part there where the fulfillment of where Jesus, and then he switched and it says, and he will make a covenant, and he will, and then they make that he become the Antichrist, but the context is Jesus taking away the sin. So it's hard for me to really hold on to tightly to one eschatological view, if I pronounce that right, because it's kind of, I don't even want to use the word confusing, but I want to encourage a listener that it's not real clear.
Yeah, it's ambiguous.
There's some things in Scripture where you do know this: He's coming again, like a thief in the night. Are you ready? Don't be drunken and weighed down with the cares of this world, and that day come upon you unexpectedly. So we're supposed to live with his return. There will be where I believe the church will be caught up. There's a going to meet Christ. Now, the tribulation, though, and you go to Revelation, the imagery, the wording is intense. I mean, it does not get more intense than that. Like the sting of a scorpion, but you will not die. Men will seek death and they will not be able to find it. And 1/3 of the earth. And it's just like apocalypse. It's massive. It's incredible. Now, again, some say, it's kind of allegory, this battle with the church. And when I read it, it seems, obviously some is imagery. The devil is not going to be bound to a literal, 1/2 inch chain that's 1,000 miles long. I mean, it's just, so there's some things in there, the harlot that rides the whore of Babylon, and it's the world system. And so it's hard because you have to read a lot of practical application as far as also literal. There's literal, but then the woman who's the enemy's after her, and this flood of water comes rushing in and saves her, and then 1/3 of the stars fall, and then that's when Satan brought 1/3 of the angels down. Well, it doesn't really say that. I mean, I'm not opposed to that view, but it doesn't really say exactly that's what happened. So it's just, I know you're chomping at the bit too to say some things.
That's okay.
But it's there's so much to say because But to answer the question is there will be a catching away. And I see people that get too caught up in it actually get too caught up in it. Years ago, people would sell all their things. They would think it's coming right away. There's many
a lot of cult groups have abused that.
A lot of failed prophecies. A lot of people are so dogmatic that they'll argue with you. You'll be amazed at how many negative emails I get just about what I just said, because I don't gravitate to their exact view. And God allows different views so we get along, so we can understand the differences. So that's what the rapture is. There will be a rapture, a catching up. With a tribulation, I don't see how, I believe that God delivers his people away from his wrath. His wrath is not poured out on his church. So I don't really see how the church would be here when the wrath of God is poured out. But others believe that if he does pour out his wrath, he would spare us like he spared Israel when the plagues hit there in Egypt and the firstborn sons were killed, and how he's spared Lot with Sodom and Gomorrah. And that could be, but that's going to be interesting because there's Christians all over the world and this massive chaotic thing is happening. And so I see, the tribulation is as it is read in the book of Revelation. I believe, we didn't have our Bibles turned there, but I believe it's Revelation 17 or so. And you can start reading there. There would be this massive war that breaks out, and tribulation for the saints of God, those who name the name of Christ. And we have to prepare for tribulation. Now, but the great tribulation where God pours out his wrath. So see, you do see you see the tribulation of the Antichrist, you see persecution, but you see when all hell breaks loose and God begins to judge his enemies. And I don't think we'll be here for that. But the bottom line is, are you ready? Are you ready for his return? These things should not, worry you. I don't want to go through the tribulation either, or my kids. And so, but we're not supposed to focus on fear and doubt and worry. We're supposed to focus on who God is, and his sovereignty is our sanity. But those are the two events. I think they're literal events, and there will be definitely some tribulation before Christ returns.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the mark in the sand with respect to this is the thing that we don't give up with respect to what kind of defines orthodoxy with respect to end times is those who deny the resurrection. So I think that that's the thing where if you're having debates, if you have people that deny the resurrection and say like, you hear coming out of liberal schools of theology, these ideas about the resurrection being this type of kind of self-actualization, or, this new agey type stuff that people talk about is like, this is what Jesus meant when he talked about the resurrection. That's not what the Bible says about the resurrection. So when you have people that deny the resurrection, I would consider that to be the line in the sand where, okay, now we're outside of orthodoxy with respect to our eschatology and our end times and what to expect. But if we're having discussions short of that, it's stuff that we have to consider interfamily dialogue and interfamily discussion within the church, and we have to be sensitive towards what, obviously, that if you have a certain view of the end times and the rapture and stuff, that can have a functional effect. I guess it could be pretty hard. It could be difficult to do organized ministry with between people that have a premillennial position versus a postmillennial position. This is, different methods of evangelism, sort of thing. And I think functionally that could be a little bit difficult, but as in terms of true fellowship within the body of Christ, we have to recognize that there will be premillennialists and pre-tribbers and post-tribbers and amillers and post-millers and all that within.
How would you sum up pre-tribulation just for the listener in one sentence?
Well, I guess
something will happen before the millennial reign of Christ.
That you have the three great, the kind of the three predominant views of the end times, the eschaton, the Greek word for last things, is with respect to the millennium mentioned in Revelation 20. So that's kind of used as the linchpin event to define where and when things are going to happen. So you have a premillennial position, you have an amillennial position, and you have a postmillennial position. And so the premillennial position states that there will be a return of Christ
before the millennial reign.
That return of Christ will usher in the millennial reign on the earth, where the kingdom is established, and then you will have the eternal state that follows that millennial reign after Satan's judgment, after his chain is broken and he's loosed and all that stuff. You have the post-millennial position, which is kind of the opposite of that. So they see the millennial reign as coming before the return of Christ. And then when they see the return of Christ, it's not a thing that's separate from his coming as the second advent to judge the world, but that they would see that as the same thing. And the nature of that position also would see the millennium as being still a time reference, a chronological reference, but they would see the millennium as not a literal 1,000-year period, but they would see it as a period that is where 1,000 is used in places like it was used in the Old Testament, where it's kind of an synonym for infinity or infinitude or boundless, So it's basically, they would say it's this boundless time where the church is growing on the earth.
Like all 7 times, other times that 1,000 years was used, it's never literal.
Right. It's euphemistic. Yeah. So you have to consider that too. And then the amillennial position, which is the prefix in Greek, which just negates. So basically it means no millennium, but that's not really, even though that's the term that's come to pass, that's not really a proper understanding of it, because people that take that position still believe in a millennial reign of Christ. But they disagree about the nature of it. It's very similar to postmillennialism in that they see Christ coming at the end of that, but they would not consider it to be earthly as in physical.
Yeah.
So postmillennials tend to have, there are even some radical parts of postmillennialism that talk about the advancement of the kingdom in government and in business. And it's this very kind of carnal expansion of the church and God's kingdom on the earth. Whereas the amillennial position would say that Christ is ruling and reigning on the earth, but he's doing so through the hearts and minds of his people.
Amillennial would say we're actually in there now.
Correct. Yeah. They would call it the church age, just like the postmillennial position would. They would call it the church age too, but they would slightly different natures as far as like how physical it is, right, and things like that, how real, quote unquote, it is on the earth and stuff like that. And the reason
the millennial is kind of a big deal is because so many fulfillments of prophecy still need to take place where Jesus ruling and reigning. And my thought has always been, why would it stop at 1,000 years? I mean, it's his reigns forever.
There's interesting questions you can ask.
And the devil's bound up, but then released again to cause havoc for a short time. And oh my Lord.
Right. So, yeah. So it's, it gets complicated. I tend to lean towards the position that Revelation 20 is talking about the church age. I'm hesitant to put a real firm stake in the ground on with respect to what
portion of it. Yeah.
Yeah. But I do think that as I've read Revelation, I tend to lean towards a historical fulfillment with respect to the judgment of Jerusalem and the conclusion of the Jewish age in 70, and then Revelation 20 being the transition through the church age that ushers into the eternal state in Revelation 21 and 22, and Matthew 24 being kind of the parallel where Jesus is prophesying the end of the Jewish age and the judgment that comes upon the Jewish age that ushers in the church age to come. So that's not to be confused with the eternal state. But I realize that in saying that there's a lot of people, even within this body in my home church here at Westside, they'll have different opinions than me that I love dearly, that I will die for, that, so it's like,
because nothing's crystal clear.
Right. And it's like, you have to follow, you have as much as you have to take your own assumptions in submission to what the word says, you also have to you can only apply the word as best as you understand it. And if it's leading you towards a certain position, that's where your conviction is.
And the more you study history, and like you mentioned 70 AD, when Titus conquered Jerusalem, I don't think a lot of people realize the magnitude of that, because Jesus said, when he said, this generation, this blood will be required from righteous, the righteous prophet to this other prophet that were killed here in the temple. On the front of the temple steps here, their blood is going to be required of this generation. This pronunciation against the Pharisees and the Sadducees on AD 70, it was conquered. They lost their whole Jerusalem. 1 million people were slaughtered. It was terrible, and you can see that. But would you say then that some of Revelation, those writing to those churches in the first 3 chapters, were to warn them of AD 70? Because my I always had trouble, because he's writing, if it is pertaining to Jerusalem, all 7 of those churches are about 600 miles up north, so they wouldn't be affected by what happened at AD 70. So I mean, in Jerusalem itself.
Yeah, and that's where the ambiguity comes in. So it's tough to say. I think too, it's like I have heard people that would be critical, not like I'm a meanie or you're a meanie or whatever, but they would just have criticisms with the perspective that I hold, that sometimes that perspective is criticized for not having a broader or a wider application for the church in terms of how the church should handle general persecution. And I think that's, I think I try to always, I think that people that say that there's certain assumptions about like where the church age is applied and things like that. But
and you can poke holes in their views too.
Yeah.
I mean,
and it's like, we don't have all the answers. So, it's like, you kind of go, it's like, okay, well that seems pretty clear, but this doesn't, so it's tough to say. I wanted to say one thing that's interesting with the rapture, we're talking about the rapture and the reconciling of the church, with Christ. The word that Paul uses to describe Christ's coming in Thessalonians is parousia, and Jesus uses that word in Matthew 24 to describe his coming and everything. And that word actually has an ancient Roman context. It was used within pagan literature to describe a specific occurrence of when, usually used of Caesar, whenever the Caesar would return to Rome, or if he would pay a visit to a major metropolis.
We'd have this big event.
The army would camp outside of the city, about a mile outside of the city, and then there would be an envoy sent into the city to announce the coming of Caesar, the Lord of the Romans, if you want to think of it that way. And then the city would they'd prepare a big festival, and then when the festival was ready, there would actually be, along with the envoy who would return to the army, there would be a procession that would be sent out to accompany Caesar and the army back into the city. And so when you see with like what, the language too of Christ, of meeting Christ in the clouds, meeting him in the air and stuff. And you think about what the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled when he says, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of glory. And he said that to Caiaphas, when he was being tried. And so it's the context for the clouds is him receiving his kingdom. And, you have this idea, I think for me, and again, this might be,
he's not riding clouds as he's coming back.
Right. And it might be, I think a lot of people, and again, this is my opinion, so this is not for anybody else necessarily, but I think for a lot of people, where a lot of people are expecting the rapture to be an event where the church is delivered from the earth, it will actually be an event where the church accompanies Christ over the earth. So I think that's when you look at the context of the parousia and what Paul is saying here, that whereas a lot of people would be looking for, the church is leaving the earth to go into heaven with the Lord.
Yeah, just sit there.
I would argue that personally, again, this is just my opinion, but I would argue that it's a situation where the church actually accompanies Christ in victory, and that would mandate that it's a second coming appearance, like you said. So that would be a one-time event. So that's just my opinion. People can take it or leave it and do their studies with respect to it.
Most people, when they come up with their views, really haven't got the views themselves studying the Bible. They hear a Bible teacher and they anchor onto that, and they really don't. And when you challenge them, they're well, this is what I've always been taught. So we just encourage people, do your own study, look to the Bible. I mean, the Old Testament imagery is huge because John uses that in Revelation. Jesus isn't coming riding a cloud like he's riding a horse. Are all these stars going to fall? Or is that a sign of judgment? I mean, there's a lot of imagery. If you tie it in with the Old Testament, it does make a lot more sense. So next time we'll hit another important topic.
That's right. And if you enjoyed listening to this topic today, please send us your ideas and topics that we can use on future episodes of Idleman Unplugged. You can get a hold of us at westsidechristianfellowship.org or ShaneIdleman.com. Again, my name is Luke Duncan, and I'm your host here with Pastor Shane Idleman. Thank you for listening to this episode of Idleman Unplugged.
Thank you for listening to Idleman Unplugged. For more information, visit us at ShaneIdleman.com. Again, that's ShaneIdleman.com.
This podcast is part of the Edify Podcast Network. Edify is a faith-inspiring app that brings together thousands of the best Christian podcasts in one place for your listening enjoyment. Cut through the noise and grow your faith by diving into the world's top Christian podcasts today. Download the Edify app for free from the App Store or Google Play, or by going to edify.app. That's edifi.app.
El Paseo Publications proudly supports the Westside Christian Fellowship Radio Network. We are committed to quality in Christian publication. Free ebooks can be found at westsidechristianfellowship.org under free ebooks. Books such as What Works for Men and What Works for Young Adults will help readers understand that the obstacles ahead are never greater than God's power to take you through. Books such as What Works When Diets Don't and Feasting and Fasting demonstrate how health can be achieved from a biblical perspective. Other free books such as Answers for a Confused Church and Desperate for More of God show the importance of fully surrendering our lives to Christ. And One Nation Above God is a must-read for anyone concerned about the direction of America. Again, free downloads of these ebooks are available at westsidechristianfellowship.org. We are happy about partnering with the Westside Christian Fellowship Radio Network.